In open court, my own parents looked the judge in the eye and swore under oath that I was dangerously unstable. They claimed I was utterly incapable of managing my own life and demanded total legal control of my bank accounts, my car, and the modest apartment I paid for on my own. Their lawyer wore a smug, confident grin, fully convinced that the conservatorship was already a done deal. That was until the judge opened the sealed dossier containing the certified list of my true financial assets. The color instantly drained from his face as he stared at the staggering net worth printed on the page. He slammed his gavel down so hard it echoed through the silent room. "Stop this proceeding immediately," he ordered, his voice shaking with sudden fury. "Call security right now. My parents thought they were stripping away everything I had to my name. They had absolutely no idea they were about to lose their own freedom. My name is Kendra, and I am 35 years old. Before I tell you how my own flesh and blood tried to legally enslave me, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch the people who should love you most reveal their true toxic colors." The air in the courtroom was stifling and heavy, smelling faintly of old wood and floor wax. I sat perfectly still at the heavy defense table, keeping my posture rigid and my face completely blank. Across the center aisle sat the people who gave me life, putting on the performance of a lifetime. My mother, Yvonne, wore a tailored navy blue suit, holding a monogrammed handkerchief to her face. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes, careful not to ruin her immaculate makeup, playing the role of the devastated matriarch to absolute perfection. Beside her sat my father, Calvin. He kept his broad shoulders slumped and his head bowed, projecting the image of a proud man broken by the tragic decline of his eldest daughter. Just behind them in the gallery sat my younger sister, Jada. She wore a somber expression, clutching the hand of her husband, Preston. Preston was a white tech entrepreneur who always carried himself with an unearned arrogance. Today, he was practically vibrating in his seat, his eyes gleaming with undisguised greed. They all thought they had me cornered. They thought I was a helpless, struggling woman about to be handed over to them on a silver platter. Their attorney, Harrison, stood at the podium addressing Judge Sterling. Harrison had the slick, overly polished look of a man who made his living destroying lives for a percentage. He spoke in a tone dripping with manufactured sympathy. "Your Honor, we are here today because a family is desperately trying to save their daughter," he declared, gesturing dramatically toward my parents. "Kendra has shown a severe pattern of erratic behavior. She is experiencing manic episodes, and we have reason to believe she is battling substance abuse issues. She is completely unfit to manage her daily life, let alone the financial inheritance she recently received. Without the intervention of a conservatorship, we fear she will cause irreparable harm to herself and her future." I listened to these horrible, fabricated lies without flinching. Beside me, my attorney, Elias, remained perfectly calm. Elias was a corporate litigator, a man who dismantled billion-dollar companies before his morning coffee. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit and casually reviewed his notes, completely unbothered by Harrison and his theatrical lies. Elias had instructed me to remain silent and let them dig their hole as deep as possible. Every perjured statement Harrison entered into the official court record was another nail in my parents' coffin. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply watched them. I watched my mother nod tearfully as Harrison described my supposed mental breakdown. I watched my father look at the judge with pleading eyes. They were willing to strip away my basic human rights, my autonomy, and my dignity, all for a modest inheritance. As Harrison continued to drone on about my fictional inadequacies, my mind drifted back to how we reached this unthinkable breaking point. Growing up in Atlanta as part of a high society church community meant that African American excellence was not just a goal to strive for. It was a ruthless, weaponized standard used to judge your worth. In our household, appearances were everything. Calvin and Yvonne cared more about optics than they ever cared about genuine connection. They sat in the front pew every Sunday, my mother in her extravagant hats and my father in his tailored suits, making sure the entire congregation saw their perfect family. They demanded prestige and traditional success. The only acceptable career paths in their eyes were medicine or law, at a top-tier firm, preferably after attending a prestigious historically black college or university. You were an investment to them, and they expected a massive social return on that investment. My younger sister Jada understood the assignment and played the game flawlessly. She was the undisputed golden child. Jada got perfect grades, went to pharmacy school, and never questioned our parents' authority. She dressed the way they wanted, spoke the way they wanted, and attended all the right social events. But her greatest achievement in their eyes was bringing home Preston. Preston was a smooth-talking tech bro from a wealthy background. To Calvin and Yvonne, having a white son-in-law who ran a tech startup was the ultimate trophy. It was their validation, their golden ticket to an even higher echelon of society. Preston was arrogant, frequently spoke over people, and treated me with barely concealed disdain. But my parents worshipped the ground he walked on. They funded his lavish lifestyle through elaborate parties to show him off, and completely ignored his obvious character flaws. He could do no wrong because he represented the status they craved. Whenever we had family dinners, Preston would monopolize the conversation, bragging about venture capital and angel investors, while my parents listened with rapt attention, treating his every word like gospel. I was the exact opposite. I refused to fit into their rigid mold. I went to a state university instead of a prestigious legacy school, which was my first great offense. The real breaking point came when I dropped out of my Master of Business Administration program. I realized the traditional corporate path was suffocating my potential, so I walked away to start my own financial consulting firm. The explosion at home was catastrophic. My parents branded me the family disappointment. They told me I was throwing my life away to pursue a foolish dream. They mocked my new business, calling it my little bookkeeping hobby to anyone who asked. Whenever family friends inquired about me, my mother would sigh heavily and say they were just praying I would eventually find my way. I was uninvited from the important social gatherings and relegated to the background of family photos. They made it abundantly clear that because I did not provide them with bragging rights, I was no longer a priority. They cut off their emotional support, but I did not let it break me. Instead, I used their rejection as fuel. While they spent the next 10 years elevating Jada and Preston, I entered a period of silent, relentless grind. I worked 16-hour days, pouring every ounce of my energy into my business. I started by consulting for small local businesses, maximizing their profits, and taking a percentage of the growth. I lived in a modest apartment, drove a reliable used car, and wore basic clothes. I sacrificed vacations, social outings, and luxury purchases. I reinvested every single dollar I earned. I quietly began acquiring commercial real estate in up-and-coming neighborhoods. I bought abandoned properties, renovated them completely, and leased them to thriving retail businesses, creating a massive steady stream of passive income. But my real breakthrough came in the technology sector. Using my deep understanding of financial markets, I built a disruptive financial technology platform designed to streamline corporate lending and debt acquisition. I hired a brilliant team of developers, and we created an algorithm that revolutionized how private equity firms assessed risk. The software took off rapidly, catching the attention of major institutional investors across the globe. Within a decade, my little bookkeeping hobby had blossomed into an $85 million empire. I owned tech patents, commercial holding companies, and a coveted seat on the executive board of a major private equity group. I was incredibly wealthy, but I made a strategic, calculated decision to keep it entirely hidden from my family. I knew my parents. I knew their toxic entitlement, their absolute obsession with money, and their willingness to exploit anyone for personal gain. If they knew about my wealth, they would demand access immediately. They would expect me to fund their luxurious lifestyle, upgrade their cars, and pay for their expensive vacations. Worse, they would use me to bail out Preston whenever his flashy startup inevitably faced financial trouble. Remaining invisible was the only way to protect my peace and the empire I had sacrificed so much to build. I let them continue to believe I was a struggling freelancer, scraping by paycheck to paycheck. I let them look down on me at Thanksgiving dinners, handing me leftover food, because they assumed I could not afford groceries. I swallowed my pride when Preston offered to pay for my coffee with a condescending smirk. I endured all of it because their underestimation was my greatest shield. And now, sitting in this courtroom watching them try to destroy my life over a fraction of what they thought I possessed, I knew that keeping my secret was the smartest thing I had ever done. They were so blinded by their own greed and arrogance that they never bothered to look past the surface. They were about to learn that the daughter they threw away had become the architect of their ultimate downfall. The catalyst for this entire legal circus was the one man who actually loved me without conditions: my grandfather. He was a sharp, observant man who built a successful logistics company from the ground up during a time when society put every possible barrier in front of an African-American entrepreneur. He did not care about country club memberships or reserving the front pew at the megachurch just to be seen by the right people. He cared about character, and he cared about discipline. He was the only person in our entire bloodline who ever looked at my modest decoy apartment and my beat-up sedan and saw the relentless work ethic behind it. He knew I was building something substantial, even if I never disclosed the exact dollar amount of my empire to him. More importantly, he saw right through my parents and their fragile house of cards. My grandfather knew about my father Calvin and his secret gambling habits. He knew my father was placing massive sports bets to fund a lifestyle he could no longer afford on his own. He knew about my sister Jada and her bottomless appetite for designer bags and luxury vehicles. He also saw right through Preston. While my parents treated my white brother-in-law like a financial genius, my grandfather recognized a sinking ship when he saw one. He knew Preston was bleeding venture capital and using my parents to float his failing tech startup. My grandfather knew with absolute certainty that if he left his wealth to Calvin Yvonne or Jada, it would be squandered before the ink on his death certificate even dried. When he passed away, the grief nearly destroyed me. The funeral was a grotesque theatrical display of fake mourning. My mother, Yvonne, wore a dramatic black veil, weeping loudly for the congregation to see, while ensuring the church photographer captured her best angles. Calvin shook hands like a politician, running for office, accepting condolences from local businessmen he owed money to. Jada complained about the humidity ruining her silk dress, while Preston literally handed out his startup business cards at the repast. I stood quietly in the back of the sanctuary, mourning the only parent I ever truly had. 3 days later, we were all summoned to the office of my grandfather's estate attorney. It was a sterile, imposing room with heavy mahogany furniture and the faint smell of lemon polish and old paper. The tension in the waiting area was suffocating, but not because of grief. It was the greedy, vibrating anticipation of a payout. Calvin sat at the head of the long conference table, radiating an arrogant entitlement. He had already started making plans for the cash. I overheard him whispering to Preston in the hallway, assuring him that a massive capital injection was coming to save his company. My mother sat beside Calvin, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the shattered daughter. Jada and Preston were huddled together, scrolling through a luxury real estate brochure on Preston's phone. They all assumed the wealth would flow directly down the traditional family hierarchy, landing squarely in their laps and bypassing me completely. I took a seat in the far corner of the room, placing maximum distance between myself and their toxic orbit. The estate attorney, a serious man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat and opened the thick ivory folder. The only sound in the room was the heavy ticking of a grandfather clock against the wall. The attorney read through the standard legal jargon, the preamble, and the burial requests. My parents nodded solemnly, soaking in the suspense. Then the attorney reached the distribution of assets. He read the numbers out loud clearly and methodically. There was a liquid estate of $250,000 in cash. In addition to the funds, there was the deed to a modest, fully renovated 12-unit apartment complex located in a rapidly gentrifying downtown neighborhood. The rental property was completely paid off and generated a highly lucrative monthly yield. My father leaned forward, his chest puffed out, ready to accept his rightful inheritance. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his expensive gold pen, ready to sign whatever transfer documents were necessary. Jada squeezed Preston's hand, and I saw Preston let out a long breath of relief, thinking his financial ruin had just been averted. But the attorney did not look at my father. He looked directly at me. "I leave the entirety of my liquid assets and the deed to the residential complex solely to my eldest granddaughter, Kendra." The attorney read, his voice steady and echoing against the wood-paneled walls. "Because she is the only one who understands the value of a dollar earned and the only one with the discipline to protect this legacy." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The silence that followed was completely deafening. Time seemed to slow down as I watched the reality of the situation crash into my family. I watched my father carefully. The arrogant, triumphant smile on his face froze instantly. His shoulders went rigid, and that smug grin slowly melted away, leaving behind a pale, sickly mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He blinked rapidly, staring at the attorney, as if his brain simply refused to process the English language. His fingers went limp, and the gold pen slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly onto the mahogany table. Next to him, my mother stopped her performative weeping. The tissue dropped from her hand onto the floor. Her posture stiffened, and her face hardened. The manufactured grief instantly morphed into raw, naked rage. The veins in her neck visibly pulsed as she whipped her head around to glare at me with a hatred so deep it chilled the room. Jada gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth in disbelief. Preston stared at the attorney with his jaw practically unhinged, his face turning an ugly shade of crimson as he realized the bailout he desperately needed had just vanished into thin air. The golden child and her perfect husband had just been financially sidelined by the family disappointment. The money they needed to maintain their fake high society facade had been handed directly to the woman they spent a decade mocking. I sat perfectly still, keeping my face neutral and my posture relaxed. I did not gloat, and I did not smile. I simply looked back at my mother and father, watching the exact moment they realized I held the keys to their survival. The battle lines were drawn right then and there. The war for my grandfather's legacy, and ultimately the war for my freedom, had officially begun. The summons came exactly 3 days later, disguised as a casual invitation to Sunday dinner. My parents lived in a sprawling brick McMansion located in a highly exclusive gated community in Buckhead. It was a massive house built entirely on credit cards and high-interest loans, perfectly designed to impress people they secretly despised. I walked through the heavy double doors and immediately felt the suffocating weight of their manufactured reality. The dining room table was set with fine china and expensive crystal glasses, but there was absolutely no food in sight. Calvin and Yvonne sat at opposite ends of the long mahogany table. Jada and Preston were seated together on one side, leaving a single empty chair for me directly in the line of fire. It was not a family dinner. It was a firing squad. I took my seat, keeping my posture rigid and placing my purse neatly on my lap. Before I could even reach for a glass of water, my father cleared his throat. He did not ask how I was holding up after the funeral, or if I was grieving. He folded his hands tightly on the polished table and got straight to the point. "Kendra, we need to discuss the gross error your grandfather made in his will," he said, his voice dripping with forced authority. "We all know his mind was slipping at the end. That money belongs to the family, and right now the family needs it positioned strategically." My mother chimed in immediately, her tone sharp and venomous. She told me I needed to sign a power of attorney and transfer the entire $250,000 liquid estate into an investment account managed exclusively by Preston. She stared at me with cold, demanding eyes, claiming that Preston's technology startup was on the verge of a massive global breakthrough. According to her, an immediate capital injection would secure generational wealth for our entire bloodline. Jada nodded enthusiastically, twisting her massive diamond engagement ring. She looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and disdain. "Come on, Kendra," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You know Preston is an absolute genius with capital. You hoarding that kind of cash for your little bookkeeping hobby is just selfish. You could destroy the family legacy just because you want to play business owner for a few more months. Be realistic and do what is best for all of us." I looked at the four of them, studying their desperate, greedy faces. They really believed they could bully me into handing over my inheritance to fund a white tech bro whose company was secretly bleeding cash. They expected me to fold the way I always did when I was a teenager, craving their approval. But I was not a teenager anymore, and I certainly did not need their validation. I kept my voice perfectly level and completely void of emotion. "No," I said simply. "I will not be signing anything over to Preston or anyone else. Grandfather left those assets to me because he knew I would protect them. The discussion is over." Preston slammed his hand down on the table, making the crystal glasses rattle dangerously. His face turned a blotchy, furious shade of red. The charming son-in-law facade vanished completely, replaced by the arrogant, unhinged entitlement of a man used to taking whatever he wanted. "You do not understand how real capital works, Kendra." He spat, his voice heavy with condescension. "You lack the basic financial literacy to handle $250,000. You are going to incur massive tax liabilities and squander it on absolute garbage. You do not know how to scale. Let the professionals handle the capital before you ruin everything your grandfather built." I did not blink. I stared right through his pale, angry face, knowing exactly how much toxic debt his failing company was drowning in. I knew things about his corporate ledgers that would make my parents physically sick. "You are the absolute last person in this room qualified to lecture me about financial literacy." "Preston," I replied, my tone turning to absolute ice. My mother stood up abruptly, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "How dare you speak to your brother-in-law that way?" she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "You arrogant, ungrateful child. He is trying to save you from your own stupidity. If you do not sign those transfer papers by tomorrow morning, you are done in this family. I will stand before the entire congregation on Sunday and tell them exactly how you stole from us while your grandfather was on his deathbed. I will have you excommunicated from the church and completely blacklisted from every social circle in Atlanta. You will have absolutely no one." She stood there panting heavily, expecting me to break down and beg for her forgiveness. She expected the threat of social isolation to force me into submission because church optics were the only currency she understood. But her threats meant absolutely nothing to a woman who had already built an empire in the shadows. I stood up slowly, smoothing out the front of my dress. I looked at my mother, my father, my sister, and the fraudulent man they worshipped. I did not raise my voice, and I did not show a single ounce of fear. "I wish you all a very good evening," I said. I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room, the rhythmic clicking of my heels echoing off their vaulted ceilings. I did not look back as I walked out the front door and stepped into the cool Atlanta night air, leaving them to stew in their own frantic desperation. For exactly 14 days, the silence from my family was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet that I knew all too well. Growing up in our household, silence was never peaceful. It was tactical. It meant Calvin and Yvonne were plotting their next move. I spent those 2 weeks working out of my decoy office located in an unremarkable strip mall on the outskirts of Midtown Atlanta. I kept this modest workspace exclusively for appearances and for handling my low-level public consulting clients. It had a cheap laminate desk, a dying potted plant, and a small waiting area that perfectly sold the illusion of a struggling freelancer trying to make ends meet. It was the exact kind of place my parents expected me to operate from. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the illusion was shattered. I was reviewing a quarterly report for one of my actual holding companies on a secure, encrypted laptop when a sharp knock rattled the frosted glass of my office door. I assumed it was a delivery driver dropping off office supplies. I unlocked the door and pulled it open to find a tall, broad-shouldered man holding a thick manila envelope. He looked down at a clipboard and then looked directly at me. He asked if I was Kendra. The moment the word left my mouth confirming my identity, his entire demeanor shifted into cold, professional detachment. He thrust the heavy envelope into my hands, stated that I had been formally served, and walked away down the corridor without looking back. I locked the door behind me and walked slowly back to my cheap laminate desk. The envelope was unusually thick, heavy with the weight of impending destruction. I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents bound by a thick metal clip. The seal of the Fulton County Superior Court was stamped across the top page. I scanned the bold black lettering reading the title of the petition. My breath caught in my throat, and a sudden chilling wave of adrenaline crashed over me. The document was a petition for an emergency involuntary conservatorship. I sat down hard in my chair, my eyes tracing the words over and over again to make sure I was not hallucinating. Calvin and Yvonne were the primary petitioners. They had gone to a judge and formally requested that the state strip me of my basic human rights. They were asking the court to grant them total and complete control over my finances, my medical decisions, my living arrangements, and my business operations. I flipped through the pages, reading the sworn statements my own parents had submitted under penalty of perjury. The lies were so monstrous, so meticulously crafted, that I felt a physical wave of nausea wash over me. In his sworn affidavit, my father claimed that I was experiencing a severe escalating manic episode. He weaponized the fact that I had dropped out of my Master of Business Administration program a decade ago, framing it as the beginning of a long-documented history of mental instability. He swore to the court that my grandfather passing away had triggered a complete psychotic break. My mother submitted a supporting affidavit that was even more vicious. She claimed with absolute certainty that I was battling a severe addiction to illicit substances. She wrote that I was spending my days in a delusional haze completely detached from reality, and entirely incapable of feeding or caring for myself. They painted a picture of a destitute, broken woman who was on the verge of destroying her own life. According to their fabricated narrative, I was a danger to myself and to the public. They argued that because of my supposed severe mental illness and rampant drug addiction, I was entirely unfit to manage my daily affairs, let alone inherit a liquid estate of $250,000 and a commercial apartment complex. They begged the court to intervene immediately to save me from myself. And their proposed solution to this fabricated tragedy was the most sickening part of the entire document. They petitioned the court to appoint my father, Calvin, and my brother-in-law, Preston, as my joint legal conservators. The sheer malice of their strategy paralyzed me for a moment. They did not just want to steal my inheritance. They wanted to enslave me legally and financially. A conservatorship meant I would lose the right to vote, the right to sign a contract, the right to marry, and the right to access a single dollar of my own money without their explicit permission. They would have the authority to forcibly commit me to a psychiatric facility, to medicate me against my will, and to liquidate any assets I possessed. They were perfectly willing to trap their own flesh and blood in a permanent legal nightmare just to get their hands on my grandfather's money. They wanted to siphon that cash directly into Preston's failing technology startup to save their own social status and preserve their precious church optics. I read through the final pages of the emergency ex parte motion. They had filed it aggressively, hoping to catch me off guard and secure a temporary freeze on my life before I could even mount a defense. They assumed I was broke. They assumed I had no resources to hire a competent attorney to fight a protracted legal battle in probate court. They firmly believed that I would be forced to rely on an overworked public defender who would easily be steamrolled by the expensive legal shark they had hired. They thought they were hunting a wounded animal that had no teeth and nowhere to hide. I slowly set the documents down on my desk. I did not cry. I did not throw anything. The initial shock evaporated, and in its place a cold, calculating rage settled deep into my bones. My parents had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had weaponized the judicial system against me. They had signed sworn documents filled with malicious lies designed to ruin my reputation and strip away my freedom. They chose money and status over their own child. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect ambush. They thought their power and influence would crush me into submission. But as I reached for my phone to make a very important phone call to my corporate litigator, I felt a dangerous smile form on my face. My parents had absolutely no idea who they had just declared war on. They thought they were cornering a struggling freelancer in a cheap midtown office. They did not know they had just handed a loaded weapon to an $85 million financial powerhouse who had the resources to bury them 10 times over. The ambush was set, but I was not going to be their prey. I was going to be their executioner. I barely had time to process the legal paperwork before the psychological warfare officially began. My phone started buzzing relentlessly later that evening, and it did not stop for days. It was not my parents calling to gloat or demand a surrender. They were much too calculating for a direct approach. Instead, they deployed the flying monkeys they had carefully groomed over decades to do their dirty work. The notifications piled up on my screen, bringing an avalanche of manufactured pity and weaponized prayers. In the affluent African American high society of Atlanta, the church is not just a place of worship. It is the ultimate social courtroom, the epicenter of community gossip, disguised as righteous concern. Calvin and Yvonne attended one of the largest, most influential megachurches in the city. It was an institution where the pastors wore bespoke designer suits, the parking lot was filled with luxury vehicles, and the congregation operated like an incredibly ruthless country club. My parents knew exactly how to wield that environment like a sword. If they wanted to legally enslave me through a conservatorship, they needed the court of public opinion to unanimously agree that I was broken beyond repair. I found out exactly how far my mother was willing to go when an old high school acquaintance sent me a video recording of that Sunday morning service. During the designated time for congregational prayer, my mother Yvonne stood up and took the microphone. She was dressed impeccably in a somber dark gray dress, wearing an expression of profound suffering that belonged on a movie poster. Her voice trembled with absolute perfection as she asked the massive congregation to bow their heads. She wept openly, begging the church to pray for her eldest daughter. Through her crocodile tears, she painted a tragic, horrifying picture of a young woman completely lost to the darkness. She told thousands of people that I was suffering a catastrophic mental breakdown and battling severe, life-threatening addictions. She asked for prayers for strength, so she and my father could bear the heavy, unbearable cross of stepping in to save my life before it was too late. She never mentioned the $250,000 inheritance or the apartment complex. She framed the impending conservatorship as an act of desperate parental love saving a drug-addicted child from the streets. She stood in front of local politicians, business leaders, and community pillars and assassinated my character with surgical precision. The congregation responded with sympathetic murmurs and loud affirmations of solidarity. The camera panned to show Jada and Preston sitting right beside her, placing comforting hands on her shoulders, playing their roles flawlessly. It was an absolute masterclass in manipulation. By the time my mother handed the microphone back to the pastor, she had successfully cemented the narrative. I was a crazy, dangerous liability, and my parents were the noble, tragic saviors making the ultimate sacrifice. The fallout from that performance was immediate and suffocating. The text messages and voicemails from my aunts, uncles, and lifelong family friends poured in like toxic sludge. My Aunt Vivian sent me a long paragraph telling me to stop fighting God's plan and to surrender to the help my loving parents were offering. An elder from the church left a 5-minute voice message telling me that pride comes before the fall and that I needed to repent, humble myself, and let my father guide my finances until my mind was clear. The most painful betrayal came from my cousin Chloe. We had grown up together sharing secrets and dreaming of escaping the suffocating expectations of our families. Chloe called me on a Tuesday afternoon, speaking to me in a slow, deliberate voice, usually reserved for a frightened child. She told me she loved me too much to watch me destroy myself and sent me links to inpatient rehabilitation centers in Florida. When I calmly tried to explain that Calvin and Yvonne were lying to steal my inheritance, Chloe sighed heavily, telling me that paranoia was a symptom of my disease. They all spoke to me like I was a fragile, ticking time bomb. It is a profoundly agonizing experience to have your entire reality denied by the people who have known you your whole life. The gaslighting was so intense, so universally coordinated, that for a fleeting, terrifying fraction of a second, I actually questioned my sanity. That is the true insidious danger of church optics and communal smear campaigns. When 100 people look at you with pity and tell you that you are insane, the sheer weight of their collective delusion threatens to crush your own truth. I was completely isolated. My extended family had drawn their battle lines, and every single one of them stood firmly behind Calvin and Yvonne. I spent hours sitting alone in my decoy office staring at my phone, as the people I shared my childhood with lined up to condemn me based on a theatrical church performance. I felt the physical ache of mourning the living, realizing that I had lost my entire support system in the span of a single weekend. They dragged my reputation through the mud without a second thought, sacrificing my dignity on the altar of my parents' greed. Calvin and Yvonne wanted me to feel so abandoned and so utterly alone that I would surrender out of sheer emotional exhaustion. They expected the crushing weight of public humiliation to break my spirit. They believed I would show up at their doorstep, begging for mercy, ready to sign away my grandfather's legacy, just to buy back their affection and clear my name in the community. They thought the threat of being a social outcast in Atlanta would force me to hand over the keys to my life. But they gravely miscalculated the woman they were dealing with. The isolation did not break me. It liberated me. When they severed the last remaining ties I had to my extended family, they accidentally cut the only strings that could have ever held me back. I was no longer bound by familial loyalty or the fear of disappointing my aunts and cousins. By burning my reputation to the ground, they handed me the ultimate freedom to fight back without mercy. The tears dried up, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception and destruction. They had no idea I was about to rewrite the rules. The psychological warfare was meant to break my spirit, but when that failed, my parents escalated their attack to hit the one thing they worshipped above all else: money. It happened on a crisp Thursday morning, just 3 days after my mother delivered her Oscar-worthy crying performance at the church. I was standing in line at a small local cafe near my decoy office, waiting to buy my usual black coffee and a blueberry muffin. I handed the young barista my everyday debit card and waited for the familiar chime of approval. Instead, the machine emitted a sharp, harsh beep. The screen flashed bright red with a single word: declined. The barista, a college student with a polite, awkward smile, handed the card back to me and asked if I wanted to try inserting the chip again. I nodded, assuming it was a simple reading error. He inserted the card and we waited. The machine beeped again. Declined. A flush of heat rose to my cheeks, not out of embarrassment, but out of a sudden, creeping suspicion. I knew exactly how much money was in that account. I apologized to the barista, stepped out of the line, and walked outside into the cool morning air to open my mobile banking app. The moment the dashboard loaded, a stark red warning banner spanned across the top of my screen. It stated that a legal hold had been placed on my profile and instructed me to contact my financial institution immediately. I quickly navigated to the inheritance account my grandfather had left me, which my attorney had recently set up. It carried the exact same red warning banner. Both accounts were entirely frozen, locked down by a court order. I could not withdraw a single cent. I immediately dialed Elias. My attorney answered on the very first ring, his voice crisp and completely devoid of panic. He told me he was already looking at the court filings. Harrison, my parents' slimy attorney, had executed a ruthless legal maneuver known as an ex parte motion. In the American legal system, an ex parte motion allows one party to seek a temporary emergency order from a judge without the other party being present or even notified, but it requires overwhelming proof of imminent danger. Elias explained exactly how they managed to bypass the burden of proof. Harrison did not just rely on the sworn lies of Calvin and Yvonne. He needed medical backing to convince a judge to freeze my assets so quickly. So my mother called in a massive favor from her high society network. Enter Dr. Angela Vance. Dr. Vance was a prominent Atlanta psychologist who sat on the executive board of my parents' church and frequently attended my mother's lavish charity brunches. According to the documents Elias read to me, Dr. Vance signed a sworn medical affidavit claiming she had unofficially observed my rapid mental decline over the past few weeks. She staked her entire medical license on a lie, swearing to the court that I was in the throes of a severe psychotic break and in imminent danger of liquidating my inheritance to fund a rampant drug addiction. They had committed federal bank fraud, medical malpractice, and perjury, all in one coordinated strike. Their strategy was as transparent as it was malicious. They wanted to starve me out. Calvin and Yvonne firmly believed I was a struggling freelancer living paycheck to paycheck, fighting to keep the lights on in a mediocre apartment. By freezing my personal checking account, they thought they were cutting off my oxygen supply. They knew my monthly rent was due in less than 5 days. They assumed I had zero savings to fall back on. They wanted to force me into absolute destitution. I could vividly picture them sitting in their sprawling Buckhead mansion, sipping expensive coffee and waiting for my inevitable surrender. They wanted me to feel the humiliating, terrifying panic of having my debit card declined for a $3 cup of coffee. They pictured me sitting in the dark with no electricity, weeping on the floor, broken and desperate. They fully expected me to dial my father's number and beg for grocery money. And the price for their benevolent parental help would be signing over the apartment complex and the $250,000 directly to Preston. Standing on the sidewalk outside that cafe looking at the frozen accounts on my phone, I actually let out a genuine laugh. It was a deep belly laugh that startled a woman walking her dog past me. The absolute irony of the situation was almost too delicious to bear. My parents thought they had trapped a helpless mouse, but they had just locked themselves in a cage with a lion. They froze a checking account that held exactly $4,212. It was the account I used to buy groceries, pay my nominal rent, and cover my streaming subscriptions. It was a perfectly constructed financial decoy, designed to maintain the illusion of my mediocre life. What Calvin, Yvonne, and their slick attorney Harrison failed to realize was that you cannot freeze an asset you do not know exists. They had absolutely no idea about the labyrinth of Delaware limited liability companies, blind trusts, and offshore corporate accounts that housed my empire. They did not freeze Horizon Capital Holdings. They did not freeze my commercial real estate yields or the $85 million in liquid capital sitting safely in encrypted corporate trusts. My financial technology platform generated more passive income in a single afternoon than what was currently locked in that petty checking account. My real wealth was completely untraceable to Kendra, the struggling freelancer. Legally, those millions belonged to a faceless corporate entity that I controlled with absolute and unquestionable authority. Harrison and my parents had just handed Elias a golden ticket. By filing those forged medical affidavits and securing a fraudulent financial freeze, they had committed a multitude of felonies. If I were actually the poor, helpless woman they thought I was, this maneuver would have destroyed my life. The fact that the legal system could be weaponized so easily against vulnerable people filled me with a cold, righteous fury. I was going to make them pay for every single lie. I put my phone away and walked calmly back into the coffee shop. I bypassed my cheap canvas tote bag and reached into the hidden zippered compartment of my designer wallet. I pulled out a heavy matte black corporate card made of solid titanium. It had no spending limit, and it did not carry my personal name. I walked up to the counter and handed it to the barista, apologizing for the earlier delay. He swiped the heavy metal card, and the machine immediately chimed with a bright green approval. I took my coffee, thanked him, and walked out into the bright Atlanta morning. My parents wanted to play a game of financial warfare, but they brought a knife to a nuclear launch. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling completely unbothered. Let them think I was starving. The trap was finally set, and they were walking right into it. 2 days after my bank accounts were frozen, I was sitting inside my decoy apartment. I deliberately maintained a lease on a cramped one-bedroom unit in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Atlanta. The place had scuffed linoleum floors, thin walls, and a rattling air conditioning unit that barely fought off the Georgia heat. It was the perfect stage to sell my struggling freelancer persona. I was sitting on a cheap faux leather sofa, reviewing a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate acquisition on a highly encrypted tablet when a heavy, aggressive pounding echoed against my front door. I locked my tablet, slipped it under a throw pillow, and walked toward the entrance. I did not check the peephole. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, expecting a delivery driver. Instead, I found myself face to face with Preston. My white brother-in-law stood in the narrow hallway wearing a designer polo shirt and expensive loafers. Usually, Preston carried himself with a smooth, practiced arrogance, playing the role of the charming, affluent tech founder perfectly. Today, however, that polished facade was visibly slipping. His posture was rigid, his jaw was clenched, and a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cool evening air. He did not wait for an invitation. He placed his hand flat against the wood and aggressively pushed the door open, stepping past me into my small living room without a shred of basic respect. I did not raise my voice. I simply closed the door behind him and turned to watch him inspect my apartment. Preston looked around at the scuffed floors and the thrift store furniture with absolute undisguised disgust. He scoffed, shaking his head as if the modest space personally offended him. "Look at this place, Kendra," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are living in absolute squalor. It genuinely breaks my heart to see you struggling like this. Your parents are worried sick about your mental state, and honestly, looking around this dump, I can entirely see why they had to step in. You clearly need someone to take the reins." I crossed my arms over my chest, maintaining my physical distance and my emotional composure. Preston dropped the concerned family member act. I replied, my tone completely flat. "My parents are not here to watch your performance. There is no audience to applaud you. Tell me exactly why you forced your way into my home." Preston dropped the fake sympathy instantly. His eyes narrowed, and the arrogant, ruthless tech bro persona took full control. He took a step toward me, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. "I am here to give you a reality check," he sneered. "You think you can fight Calvin and Yvonne in probate court? You think you can hire some cheap public defender to go up against Harrison? Let me explain exactly how the legal system works for people who actually have capital. We will bury you in psychological evaluations, character depositions, and emergency motions. We will drag this conservatorship battle out for years. We have already frozen your bank accounts. We know you are broke, Kendra. You cannot even afford to buy groceries right now, let alone pay a retainer for a competent attorney." He paced across the small living room, treating my home like a boardroom he was preparing to conquer. He was leveraging his perceived wealth and the systemic power dynamics he thought he held over a single black woman. He firmly believed that his money and his status made him invincible. "If you fight us, you will lose everything," he continued, his voice rising with aggressive confidence. "Harrison will make sure the judge sees you as a combative, unstable addict. We will have you committed for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation. We will drain whatever pathetic savings you have left until you are literally homeless. You will be broken and you will have absolutely nothing. But I am a reasonable man, and I want to save this family from a messy public scandal." Preston reached into the inside pocket of his designer jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto my cheap coffee table with a resounding thud. "That is a settlement agreement," he stated, crossing his arms. "I convinced your parents to offer you a way out. If you sign those papers right now, Calvin and Yvonne will drop the conservatorship petition entirely. They will unfreeze your petty checking account and leave you alone." I looked down at the envelope and then back up at Preston. "And what exactly does that agreement require me to do?" I asked, my voice remaining eerily calm. Preston smirked, thinking he had successfully backed me into a corner. "You sign over the entire $250,000 liquid estate, and you transfer the deed to the apartment complex," he demanded. "But you do not transfer it to your parents. You transfer the assets directly to my holding company. I will absorb the real estate into my corporate portfolio, and I will use the cash to scale my tech startup. You get to keep your freedom, and I get the capital I need to take my company public. It is a generous offer, Kendra. It is the only lifeline you are going to get." I stared at him, letting a heavy, unbroken silence fill the room. The sheer audacity of his extortion plot was staggering, but more importantly, it was incredibly revealing. I looked closely at his face. I noticed the dark circles under his eyes. I noticed the slight desperate tremor in his hands when he tossed the envelope onto the table. I saw the nervous, frantic energy radiating from his posture. This was not the behavior of a wealthy, successful entrepreneur making a strategic acquisition. This was the behavior of a drowning man gasping for air. In that moment, the entire puzzle clicked together perfectly in my mind. This conservatorship was never about my mental health. It was never even about Calvin and Yvonne preserving their family legacy. This entire legal ambush was orchestrated by Preston because his startup was secretly bleeding cash. He was completely broke, and he had convinced my greedy, status-obsessed parents to help him steal my grandfather's money to bail him out. He was using Calvin and Yvonne as pawns to save his own sinking ship. Preston shifted uncomfortably under my silent, piercing gaze. Well, he snapped, his patience wearing thin. "Are you going to sign the papers, or are you going to be stupid enough to fight me?" I did not scream, I did not cry, I did not waste my breath defending my sanity or explaining my financial literacy. I simply walked over to the front door, grabbed the handle, and pulled it wide open. The cool evening air rushed into the stifling apartment. I turned back to Preston and looked him dead in the eye with a cold, calculating intensity that made his arrogant smirk falter. "I am not signing a single page of your extortion attempt, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a chilling, authoritative register. "You can take your settlement agreement and walk out of my home right now." Preston stared at me, his face turning a furious shade of red. "You are making the biggest mistake of your pathetic life," he spat, grabbing the manila envelope off the table. "We are going to destroy you in front of a judge. You will be begging for this deal when you are locked in a psychiatric ward." I stood perfectly still, holding the door open. "I will see you in court, Preston," I replied, my tone completely void of fear. He stormed past me, his shoulder deliberately brushing against mine, in a final pathetic attempt at physical intimidation. He marched down the hallway, his heavy footsteps echoing angrily against the cheap walls. The moment he cleared the threshold, I slammed the heavy door shut, locking the deadbolt with a resounding click. I walked straight back to my sofa and pulled my encrypted tablet out from under the pillow. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. I felt an exhilarating rush of absolute clarity. They had shown their entire hand. They had handed me the exact motive behind their fraudulent legal filings. I immediately dialed Elias, my corporate litigator. My attorney needed to know that our opposition was not just greedy, but financially desperate. The intimidation tactic had failed spectacularly. Preston thought he was delivering a death sentence, but he had just handed me the very weapon I would use to orchestrate his total annihilation. After ending the call with Elias, the residual adrenaline from confronting Preston slowly drained out of my system. What replaced it was a heavy, suffocating silence that settled over my modest decoy apartment like a thick woolen blanket. For the next 3 days, my phone did not ring a single time. There were no text messages. There were no missed calls. The church congregation and my extended relatives had already delivered their initial wave of weaponized prayers and condescending advice. Now they had seamlessly transitioned into the isolation phase of my parents' psychological warfare. This was a specific, highly calculated kind of emotional torture, designed to break my spirit through sheer absolute loneliness. Calvin and Yvonne wanted me to feel the terrifying, crushing weight of being entirely cut off from my bloodline. In the African American community, family is often presented as the ultimate safety net, the unbreakable foundation that catches you when the rest of the world turns its back. To be deliberately severed from that network is a profound kind of exile. I decided to make one final desperate attempt to reach the few family members I believed truly knew my heart. I dialed the number of my cousin Maya. Maya and I had spent our childhood summers sitting on our grandmother's front porch, braiding each other's hair and whispering our secret ambitions. She was the one person who always defended me when Jada made snide remarks about my clothes or my career choices. I listened as the phone rang endlessly until it finally clicked over to voicemail. I left a calm, rational message begging her to call me back just to hear my side of the story. Next, I texted my Aunt Denise. She was my father's sister and had always been the pragmatic voice of reason at our chaotic family gatherings. I watched the delivery receipt change to read almost instantly, but no reply ever materialized on my screen. Hours later, Maya finally sent a brief, automated-looking text message. It read that she loved me dearly, but could not in good conscience enable my destructive behavior. She added that she was praying for my recovery and would welcome me back once I surrendered to my parents' guidance. That was the exact moment the final heavy door slammed shut in my face. The reality of my situation crashed into me with the devastating force of a freight train. I was completely, unequivocally alone. I slid down the wall of my cramped kitchen and sat on the scuffed linoleum floor, pulling my knees tight to my chest. I allowed myself to finally cry. I did not shed tears because I was afraid of Preston or his empty threats. I did not cry because I feared Harrison and his fraudulent court filings. I cried because I had to bury the illusion of my parents. I had to face the horrifying, unvarnished truth that Calvin and Yvonne did not love me. They did not even see me as a human being worthy of basic dignity. I was nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle standing between them and a financial payout. Sitting on that cold kitchen floor, I forced myself to mentally dissect the absolute depravity of their betrayal. My own flesh and blood were fully prepared to have me locked inside a psychiatric facility against my will. They were perfectly willing to let doctors pump my veins full of heavy sedatives to drug me into a docile, compliant state so they could legally seize my assets. They would have watched me lose my mind, my freedom, and my entire future without shedding a single genuine tear. And they were orchestrating this monumental human rights violation just to secure a $250,000 lifeline for Preston. They chose the arrogant, failing tech bro over their own daughter. They chose their country club memberships, their luxury vehicles, and their front row pew at the megachurch over my basic right to exist as a free woman. The betrayal was so profound, so uniquely evil, that it defied all logic and reason. They were willing to sacrifice me on the altar of their social status simply because I refused to fund their fake reality. I let the tears flow until my eyes burned and my throat ached. I cried for the little girl who used to bring home straight-A report cards, hoping for a single word of validation from a mother who only cared about appearances. I cried for the teenager who tried so hard to fit into their rigid, suffocating mold. I mourned the family I always wanted, but never actually had. And then something inside me shifted. The crying stopped completely. The profound sadness evaporated, leaving behind a vast hollow cavern in my chest. Slowly, that dark cavern began to fill with a different kind of energy. It filled with a diamond-cold, hardened resolve. I realized that mourning the loss of my family was a massive waste of my time and resources, because the family I was crying for was a complete fantasy. The people who raised me were emotional vampires who only valued what they could extract from you. They did not possess the capacity for unconditional love. I stood up from the kitchen floor, my legs steady, and my breathing calm. I walked into the cramped bathroom and splashed freezing cold water on my face. I looked directly at my reflection in the stained mirror above the sink. The vulnerable, desperate daughter seeking her parents' approval was officially dead. She died the very second Preston threw that extortion agreement onto my coffee table. The woman staring back at me now was the ruthless architect of an $85 million empire. My jaw set into a firm, rigid line, and my eyes held absolutely no mercy. I dried my face with the towel and walked back into the living room to retrieve my encrypted tablet. The total isolation they imposed on me was no longer a punishment. It was my greatest strategic advantage. Because they had completely cut me off and instructed the entire extended family to ignore me, they had absolutely no eyes on my movements. They had voluntarily blindfolded themselves, thinking I was paralyzed by grief and fear. They had no idea I was mobilizing for war. I picked up my phone and called Elias back to schedule an urgent in-person strategy session at his downtown corporate firm. I told my attorney that I was completely done playing defense. The time for quietly absorbing their psychological abuse was over. I instructed Elias to deploy every single resource at our disposal. It was time to rip the floorboards out from under their entire operation and expose the rotting foundation of their perfect lives. The mourning period had officially ended, and the season of absolute destruction was about to begin. I walked into the sleek glass lobby of Elias's corporate law firm less than an hour later. The environment was a stark contrast to my cramped decoy apartment. This was a realm of polished marble panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline and ruthless efficiency. Elias was waiting for me in his corner office. He was a shark in a custom-tailored suit, a man who dismantled corporate monopolies and destroyed hostile takeovers for sport. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I dropped the thick stack of conservatorship filings and the extortion agreement Preston had left behind directly onto his expansive mahogany desk. Elias did not react with shock or pity. He simply adjusted his glasses and began reading with clinical precision. I watched his eyes scan the perjured affidavits, the fabricated psychological evaluation, and the aggressive demands for my inheritance. When he reached the extortion agreement Preston had so foolishly printed and handed to me, Elias leaned back in his leather chair and let out a sharp, humorless laugh. He pointed out that Harrison, their slimy attorney, had made a fatal error by allowing Preston to draft a completely illegal settlement offer that essentially admitted the entire conservatorship was a coordinated financial shakedown. But we both knew that simply defending myself in probate court was not enough. Defending meant playing their game. I told Elias I wanted to obliterate them. I wanted to drag their darkest secrets into the light and dismantle their fake reality piece by piece. Elias pressed a button on his desk phone and summoned his lead forensic accountant. The directive was simple. We needed to know exactly why a supposedly successful tech entrepreneur and two prominent high society figures were willing to risk federal prison for a mere $250,000. In the circles my parents pretended to run in, that amount of money was a rounding error. For them to orchestrate such a malicious high-stakes legal ambush meant they were suffocating. We needed to find out exactly who was holding the pillow over their faces. Within 48 hours, Elias and his team of financial investigators had cracked the polished facade of my family wide open. The forensic accountant laid out a web of financial rot so extensive and so deeply pathetic that it almost took my breath away. We started with Preston. For years, my parents had paraded my white brother-in-law around their country club and church, treating him like the second coming of Steve Jobs. They worshipped his arrogance because they thought his tech startup was their ticket to generational wealth. The truth was violently different. Preston's company was nothing more than a hollow shell game. He had burned through his initial venture capital funding in less than 2 years, squandering millions on luxury leased vehicles, extravagant office spaces, and lavish corporate retreats to maintain the illusion of success. His groundbreaking software had never actually made it past the beta testing phase. But the most damning revelation was not just his incompetence, it was his criminality. Elias handed me a confidential legal briefing, revealing that Preston was currently the target of an active federal audit. The Securities and Exchange Commission was actively investigating his startup for misappropriating investor funds. He was bleeding cash rapidly, and he was terrified of facing federal indictment. He desperately needed $250,000 to cover an imminent payroll deficit and silence a vendor who was threatening to blow the whistle on his fraud. The puzzle pieces locked together perfectly. Preston was a fraud, but he could not pull off this conservatorship ambush alone. He needed Calvin and Yvonne to use their parental authority to weaponize the probate court against me. So we turned the investigation toward my parents. I asked Elias to pull every public financial record, property deed, and credit report attached to Calvin and Yvonne. What we uncovered about my parents' finances was even more disturbing than Preston's federal audit. My parents had built their entire identity on being the affluent pillars of their megachurch. They drove imported luxury cars, wore designer clothing, and publicly bragged about their exclusive zip code in Buckhead. The forensic accountant slid a stack of property records across the desk. Their sprawling brick McMansion, the very house where they had mocked my career and demanded I hand over my inheritance, was leveraged to the absolute brink of foreclosure. Calvin and Yvonne had taken out a first mortgage, a secondary mortgage, and a highly toxic variable rate line of credit against their home. They had completely drained their retirement accounts. And where had all that money gone? It had not just gone to my father's secret sports betting habit, although we found plenty of evidence of that. The vast majority of their suffocating debt had been quietly funneled directly into Preston's failing startup. The sheer level of self-hatred and social desperation required to make those financial decisions made me physically sick. My parents had bankrupted themselves to bail out a mediocre, arrogant man simply because he provided them with proximity to whiteness and perceived elite status. They had mortgaged their own future to protect his fragile ego and maintain their pristine church optics. And when their well ran completely dry, when they had no more equity to drain and no more credit cards to max out, they set their sights on the one person they viewed as entirely disposable: me. They realized my grandfather had bypassed their greedy hands and left $250,000 to the family disappointment. Instead of facing the consequences of their own horrific financial mismanagement, they conspired to legally enslave me. They were fully prepared to drug me, lock me in a psychiatric ward, and strip away my human rights just to steal my inheritance and hand it to the very man who had already bankrupted them. They were going to sacrifice their black daughter to prop up their fraudulent son-in-law. I sat in Elias' office, staring at the mountain of financial documents proving their absolute moral bankruptcy. A cold, metallic calm washed over my entire body. I did not feel a single ounce of familial pity for their impending ruin. They had dug a massive grave for me and planned to bury me alive inside it. I looked up at Elias, my voice steady and completely void of hesitation. I told him we were not going to settle, and we were not going to file an emergency injunction to stop the conservatorship hearing. We were going to walk right into that courtroom. We were going to let Harrison submit their forged medical affidavits and their perjured testimony onto the official court record. We were going to let them swear under oath that they were acting out of loving parental concern. And then we were going to drop a nuclear bomb on their entire existence. I sat across from Elias in his immaculate corner office, letting the reality of my parents' absolute financial ruin settle over me. They had destroyed their entire lives to prop up an arrogant man who was currently being hunted by federal auditors. But the universe has a highly specific sense of irony, and I was about to discover just how beautifully the stars had aligned. I asked Elias to slide his encrypted laptop across the wide mahogany desk. I told him I needed to access my primary holding company's internal network to verify something that had just clicked into place in the back of my mind. I logged into my executive dashboard, authenticating my identity through 2 layers of security. The screen loaded, displaying the vast, complex web of corporate entities, limited liability companies, and private equity funds that made up my $85 million empire. I navigated directly to the distressed asset acquisition portfolio. My financial technology firm did not just develop software. We actively purchased toxic debt from failing technology startups for pennies on the dollar, restructuring or liquidating them for massive corporate profits. About 3 months ago, my portfolio managers had flagged a rapidly sinking software company in the logistics sector. The company was bleeding cash, missing payroll, and defaulting on major vendor contracts. My team executed a hostile acquisition of their primary debt obligations, effectively becoming their largest senior creditor. I typed Preston's company name into the search bar and hit enter. A massive, detailed financial file populated on the screen. I turned the laptop around and pushed it back across the desk toward Elias. I watched his eyes scan the digital documents. The ruthless corporate shark, who rarely showed any emotion, was momentarily stunned. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face as he realized what he was looking at. I did not just have the capital to fight Preston in probate court. I literally owned his company. I held the exclusive rights to his corporate debt. With a single phone call to my portfolio managers, I could call in those loans and force his startup into immediate involuntary bankruptcy. I owned his entire future. But I was not finished. I told Elias to bring up the property records for my parents' sprawling brick mansion in Buckhead. We looked at the secondary mortgage they had taken out to quietly funnel cash into Preston's failing business. The lender was a subsidiary of a massive private equity group based out of Delaware. I opened a new tab on the browser and logged into a completely different executive portal. I navigated to the Board of Directors directory and turned the screen back to my attorney. My name sat right there at the very top of the executive board list. I did not just hold shares in the private equity group that owned my parents' toxic mortgage. I was a senior voting member. I literally held the leash to the house they had tried to kick me out of when I was a teenager. The magnitude of the irony was staggering. My parents and my brother-in-law were conspiring to legally enslave me. They had forged medical documents and ruined my reputation in our church community, all to steal $250,000 from me to pay off their suffocating debts. But the entity they actually owed all of that money to was me. They were trying to rob a bank without realizing they were attacking the owner of the bank. I let that profound realization wash over the room. The silence between Elias and me was heavy with absolute, unquestionable power. Elias leaned forward, placing his elbows on the desk. His legal mind was working at light speed, analyzing the angles. He told me that we could crush them right now without ever stepping foot inside a courtroom. He explained that we could send a massive cease and desist letter, freeze Preston's corporate assets, initiate foreclosure proceedings on my parents' house today, and make the conservatorship petition vanish instantly. He said it would be clean, fast, and completely devastating. They would be ruined by the end of the business day. I looked at him and slowly shook my head. I told him that clean and fast was a courtesy reserved for people who made honest mistakes. Calvin, Yvonne, and Preston did not make a mistake. They maliciously and deliberately plotted to strip me of my basic human rights. They paid off a corrupt therapist to fabricate medical records. They stood in front of a church congregation and slandered my name. They tried to leave me with absolutely nothing, entirely dependent on their twisted mercy. Clean and fast was absolutely not an option. Elias understood perfectly. The predatory smile returned to his face as he laid out the alternative strategy. He told me we were going to do absolutely nothing to stop the emergency conservatorship hearing. We were going to play the part of the terrified, defenseless victim flawlessly. We would let their slimy attorney Harrison file every single piece of fabricated evidence with the court clerk. We would let my parents stand before a federal judge and swear under penalty of perjury that their malicious lies were the absolute truth. Elias explained the severe legal ramifications of this strategy. He told me that once they entered those forged medical documents into the official court record under oath, it ceased to be a simple family dispute. It immediately became criminal extortion. It became felony perjury. It became severe medical malpractice for their therapist friend. By letting them proceed without interruption, we were handing them the exact rope they needed to hang themselves. If we stopped them now, they could claim it was just a misunderstanding. If we let them lie to a judge, they would guarantee their own prison sentences. I agreed to the plan without a single second of hesitation. For the next week, I fully embraced the silence. I completely ignored the pitying text messages from my cousins and the self-righteous voicemails from the church elders. I stayed locked inside my dingy decoy apartment and let them all believe they had completely broken my spirit. I let Preston think his pathetic intimidation tactics had worked. I let my mother practice her fake tragic tears in the mirror, getting ready for her big performance in front of the judge. I did not make a sound. The night before the court date, I stood in the middle of my cheap living room and packed a modest handbag. I selected a plain, conservative gray dress that perfectly fit the image of a subdued, struggling woman who had lost the will to fight. I looked at myself in the stained bathroom mirror and practiced looking defeated, keeping my shoulders slumped and my eyes cast downward. The trap was meticulously set, and the bait had been swallowed whole. Tomorrow morning, my entire family would walk into the courtroom expecting a slaughter. And they were absolutely right. There was going to be a bloodbath. It just was not going to be mine. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Probate Court swung shut behind me, sealing us inside the sterile, suffocating room. I walked down the center aisle wearing the plain, conservative gray dress I had carefully selected the night before. I kept my shoulders slightly slumped and my eyes cast downward, playing the role of the broken, defeated woman they all expected to see. I took my seat at the heavy wooden defense table next to my attorney, Elias. He wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored suit, radiating a quiet, lethal authority, but he remained perfectly silent. We had agreed beforehand that we would not interrupt their performance. We were going to give them all the rope they needed. I allowed my gaze to drift across the center aisle to the plaintiff's table. The smug, sickening confidence radiating from my family was almost palpable in the chilled courtroom air. They looked like people who had already won the lottery and were just waiting for the giant novelty check to be printed. My mother, Yvonne, had dressed for the occasion with calculated precision. She wore a modest but clearly expensive navy blue suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. She clutched a monogrammed handkerchief tightly in her hands, holding it close to her chest so she could dab at her dry eyes whenever the judge looked in her direction. She was playing the role of the devastated, fiercely loving matriarch to absolute perfection. Beside her sat my father, Calvin. He kept his broad shoulders rigid and his jaw clenched, projecting the image of a proud, stoic man burdened by the tragic decline of his eldest daughter. He nodded solemnly at their attorney, Harrison, leaning in to whisper something that made Harrison smirk. Just behind them in the gallery sat my younger sister, Jada, and her white husband, Preston. Jada wore a dark tailored dress, her face arranged into a mask of practiced sorrow. She held Preston's hand tightly, but there was no real comfort in the gesture. It was all for optics. Preston, on the other hand, could barely contain his predatory excitement. He was literally bouncing his knee nervously, his eyes darting around the room with undisguised greed. He looked at me like a vulture eyeing a wounded animal, fully convinced that my inheritance was mere minutes away from saving his fraudulent bankrupt startup. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and Judge Sterling emerged from his chambers. The judge was a man of immense presence with sharp, perceptive eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that commanded instant respect. He took his seat at the high bench, adjusted his glasses, and called our docket number. He looked down at the massive stack of emergency filings on his desk, and then looked out at the room, his gaze sweeping over my parents before landing heavily on me. Attorney Harrison immediately stood up and took his place at the podium. Harrison was a slick, overly polished lawyer who made his living destroying vulnerable people for a handsome retainer. He smoothed the lapels of his suit, cleared his throat, and launched into a theatrical, deeply manipulative opening statement. Your Honor, we are here today out of absolute desperation. Harrison began, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. Before you sits a family that has exhausted every possible avenue to save their daughter. Kendra has unfortunately alienated her loving, supportive parents due to a severe and rapidly escalating mental health crisis. We are asking this court for an emergency involuntary conservatorship to protect her from causing irreparable harm to herself and her financial future. I sat perfectly still, listening to this polished shark assassinate my character on the public record. Elias sat beside me, his hands folded neatly on the table, his expression completely unreadable. Harrison paced slowly in front of the podium, gesturing toward my parents. He painted a picture of a tragic fall from grace. He told Judge Sterling about my grandfather passing away, claiming the sudden grief had triggered a complete psychotic break that had been secretly brewing for years. He weaponized my decision to drop out of my graduate program a decade ago, framing it as the beginning of a long-documented history of mental instability. He explicitly referred to my massive financial consulting firm as a failing freelance bookkeeping hobby that barely kept a roof over my head. To support these horrific claims, Harrison physically handed a sealed folder to the court clerk. Your Honor, I am submitting a sworn medical affidavit from a prominent licensed Atlanta psychologist, he stated, projecting his voice so the court reporter would catch every single syllable. This medical professional has observed Kendra closely and has diagnosed her with severe manic episodes coupled with active illicit substance abuse. She is entirely detached from reality and is a clear and present danger to herself. My mother let out a perfectly timed, trembling sob, pressing her handkerchief to her face. My father wrapped a comforting arm around her shoulders, leaning his head against hers. The performance was flawless. Harrison then pivoted to the financial narrative, which was the entire reason we were in this room. He described my decoy apartment, painting it as a dangerous, dilapidated unit in an unsafe neighborhood. He told the judge that I was living in abject poverty, completely incapable of paying my basic bills. He stated that introducing a $250,000 inheritance and the deed to a commercial apartment complex into my chaotic, destructive life would be a fatal mistake. He swore to the court that I would squander my grandfather's hard-earned legacy on illicit habits within a matter of weeks, leaving me destitute and homeless. Because of this imminent danger, Harrison continued raising his voice for dramatic effect. We formally request that the court grant total legal and financial authority to her father, Calvin, and her brother-in-law, Preston. Preston is the chief executive officer of a highly successful technology firm. He possesses the advanced financial literacy and corporate infrastructure required to properly manage and protect these inherited assets until Kendra can be rehabilitated. The sheer audacity of calling Preston a highly successful financial expert made a cold, dark laugh bubble up in the back of my throat. The man was drowning in toxic debt and being hunted by federal auditors, yet Harrison was presenting him to a federal judge as my financial savior. Preston sat up taller in the gallery, puffing out his chest and attempting to look exceptionally responsible. Judge Sterling listened quietly, his face giving nothing away. He flipped through the forged medical documents and the aggressive legal petitions. He then looked directly at my parents. The law requires that claims of this magnitude be affirmed under oath, he stated, his voice echoing sharply in the quiet room. The bailiff stepped forward and asked Calvin and Yvonne to stand and raise their right hands. I watched unblinking as the two people who brought me into this world swore before God and the judicial system to tell the whole truth. Calvin spoke directly into his microphone, firmly confirming every single malicious lie Harrison had just delivered. He stated under penalty of perjury that I was a drug-addicted, mentally incompetent danger to society. Yvonne wept openly, nodding along and adding that she just wanted her sweet daughter back safe and sound under their protection. They did it. They actually did it. They officially entered their extortion plot and their fabricated medical documents into the federal court record. They committed multiple severe felonies right in front of a judge, all to steal a fraction of my wealth to save their fake high society reality. I felt no sadness. I felt no grief. I felt a cold clinical satisfaction spreading through my veins. Beside me, Elias finally unclasped his hands. He reached down into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy binder stamped with the gold seal of my primary corporate holding company. The trap had been fully deployed. My parents had firmly locked the doors from the inside and thrown away the key. Now it was our turn to speak. Elias stood up slowly, drawing the attention of the entire courtroom. He buttoned his suit jacket with a single fluid motion. There was no theatrical sigh, no dramatic wiping of invisible tears. He was the embodiment of chilling corporate precision. When he spoke, his voice did not boom or echo with manufactured emotion like Harrison. Instead, it was measured sharp and carried a quiet authority that instantly commanded the room. Your Honor. Elias began, looking directly at Judge Sterling. The petitioners have entered incredibly severe allegations into the official record today. They have painted my client as a woman completely devoid of reason, incapable of caring for her basic needs, and utterly incompetent to manage her financial affairs. They have asked this court to take the extreme and irreversible step of stripping an adult woman of her autonomy. Harrison leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a smug, self-satisfied smile. He clearly thought Elias was about to launch into a desperate emotional defense, begging the judge to reconsider the forged medical documents. My mother Yvonne let out another soft, practiced sniffle, playing her part to the bitter end. My father Calvin kept his chin raised high, looking at Elias with barely concealed disdain. But Elias did not take the bait. He did not waste a single breath arguing about the fabricated substance abuse claims or the fraudulent psychological evaluation. He knew that arguing against a lie only gives it validation. Instead, he struck directly at the foundational legal requirement of their petition. A conservatorship at its very core requires the absolute burden of proving financial incompetence. Elias continued, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. The petitioners must prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that my client lacks the capacity to secure, manage, and protect her own assets. Attorney Harrison has spent the last 20 minutes claiming my client is living in abject poverty, incapable of paying her rent, and entirely unequipped to handle a $250,000 inheritance. Elias stepped out from behind our defense table, holding the thick, heavy leather binder in his right hand. The gold-embossed seal of my primary holding company caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courtroom. He walked deliberately toward the judge's bench, his footsteps echoing against the polished hardwood floor. To address that specific legal standard, Your Honor, we will not be submitting emotional counter-testimony, Elias stated. We will not be calling character witnesses to debate the petitioner's malicious claims. Instead, I am submitting a certified, fully audited financial dossier detailing my client's current active holdings, corporate assets, and liquid capital. I watched Harrison from the corner of my eye. He actually let out a quiet, scoffing laugh, shaking his head in amusement. He leaned over and whispered something behind his hand to my father. Calvin nodded, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. They thought Elias was grasping at straws. They firmly believed he was about to hand the judge a pathetic stack of tax returns from my struggling freelance bookkeeping business. They pictured a handful of unpaid invoices and a meager checking account statement trying to pass as proof of financial stability. Up in the gallery, Preston shifted in his seat, leaning forward eagerly. I could see the greedy anticipation radiating from his pale face. He thought the binder contained the exact banking details of my grandfather's inheritance. He was practically salivating at the thought of finally getting his hands on the capital he desperately needed to save his sinking tech startup. Jada sat next to him, looking bored and slightly annoyed that the hearing was taking so long. She just wanted the judge to sign the paperwork so they could go celebrate at an expensive restaurant. Elias handed the heavy binder to the court clerk, who passed it up to Judge Sterling. This dossier has been prepared and certified by one of the top independent accounting firms in the country, Elias explained, keeping his eyes locked on the judge. It contains comprehensive tax filings, verified deeds of ownership, bank-certified liquidity statements, and corporate board appointments, all directly held or controlled by my client. We submit to the court that these documents do not merely prove baseline competency. They demonstrate a level of financial sophistication and corporate management that renders this entire conservatorship petition fundamentally absurd. Harrison stood up quickly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He could not resist the urge to perform for his clients. Your Honor, I object to this waste of the court's time. Harrison interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. Submitting a few freelance invoices or a modest business ledger does not negate the sworn medical testimony of a licensed psychologist. The fact that she might have filed taxes for her little hobby business does not mean she is mentally equipped to handle a sudden influx of real capital. My clients are trying to save her life, and opposing counsel is trying to dazzle the court with paperwork. Judge Sterling held up his hand, silencing Harrison instantly. The judge was known for his sharp intellect and his absolute intolerance for courtroom games. He looked down at the thick leather binder resting on his desk. He ran his hand over the embossed cover, feeling the weight and the undeniable quality of the presentation. I will determine what constitutes a waste of time in my courtroom. Counselor, the judge reprimanded Harrison sternly. If the defense counsel claims this document proves financial competency, I am legally obligated to review it before ruling on a motion that would strip an individual of their constitutional rights. Harrison sat back down looking mildly chastised, but still entirely arrogant. He adjusted his tie and shot a reassuring wink back at Preston and Jada in the gallery. He was so incredibly blind to the reality of the situation. They all were. They were trapped in their own delusions of superiority, fully convinced that a black woman who refused to follow their rigid social script could never amount to anything more than a failure. I remained perfectly still in my seat, keeping my breathing slow and measured. I did not look at my parents. I did not give them the satisfaction of making eye contact. I kept my gaze fixed entirely on Judge Sterling. The entire room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as the judge slowly opened the cover of the dossier. Elias walked back to the defense table and took his seat beside me. He did not look at Harrison or my family either. He simply reached out and adjusted a single pen on the table, the picture of a man who had already won the war. Your Honor. Elias added, his voice breaking the quiet tension in the room, just as the judge turned to the first executive summary page. I direct your attention to the first tab, which outlines my client's primary holding entity, Horizon Capital Holdings. You will find the certified net worth assessment on page 3, followed by the asset distribution breakdown. The trap was completely sprung. Every perjured statement my parents had made under oath was currently sitting on the official court record. Every malicious lie Harrison had spun about my poverty and my inability to manage money was echoing in the judge's ears. They had built a towering, fragile house of cards based entirely on their own unchecked arrogance, and I was sitting right there watching the match being struck. The silence in the courtroom was so absolute that I could hear the sharp rustle of the thick parchment paper as Judge Sterling turned the very first page of the dossier. I kept my eyes locked entirely on him, watching the exact moment the meticulously constructed reality of my parents shattered into a million pieces. Judge Sterling looked at the executive summary for Horizon Capital Holdings. His eyes tracked across the top line where the certified net worth assessment was printed in bold black ink. $85 million. I saw his brow furrow slightly, as if his brain was struggling to reconcile the astronomical figure with the pitiful narrative Harrison had just spoon-fed him. He took off his reading glasses, wiped them quickly with a microfiber cloth, and put them back on his face. He looked at the number again. The color began to visibly drain from his cheeks, replacing his usual stern judicial complexion with a pale, stunned mask of absolute shock. He looked up from the dossier and stared directly at me. His gaze shifted from the plain, conservative gray dress I wore to the cold, unblinking confidence in my eyes. I did not break eye contact. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod, confirming that everything he was reading was the absolute, undeniable truth. The judge then turned his attention to Harrison. Harrison was still standing near the plaintiff's table, smirking and whispering something to my father, Calvin. They were completely oblivious. They thought the judge was carefully reviewing a stack of pathetic freelance invoices. They had no idea they were standing on a live landmine. Judge Sterling abruptly looked back down at the binder, flipping to the next section with sudden urgency. I watched his eyes widen as he processed the sheer magnitude of the empire I had built. He scanned the ironclad deeds to over 24 commercial properties spread across the greater Atlanta area. He turned the page and read through the registration documents for multiple groundbreaking financial technology patents. He saw the complex but flawlessly organized corporate structures of my holding companies. Every single page was certified, notarized, and stamped by one of the most prestigious accounting firms on the planet. The narrative of a drug-addicted, mentally incompetent woman living in abject poverty evaporated instantly. The documents proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that I was a highly sophisticated corporate titan executing multi-million-dollar acquisitions on a daily basis. The very idea that I lacked the financial literacy to manage a mere $250,000 inheritance was laughable. But Elias and I were not finished. We did not just want to prove my competence, we wanted to expose their criminality. I watched Judge Sterling turn to the final tab in the dossier, Elias had clearly labeled this section as associated debt profiles and conflict of interest disclosures. The judge began reading the comprehensive financial audit of Preston's highly praised technology startup. I saw his lips part slightly in disbelief as he read the federal audit warnings, the massive payroll deficits, and the crushing vendor debt. Then he saw the corporate acquisition record. He realized that my financial technology firm had quietly purchased all of Preston's toxic debt 3 months prior. I was legally Preston's largest senior creditor. The judge aggressively turned to the next page, which detailed the bleak financial reality of my parents. He read through the primary mortgage, the secondary mortgage, and the toxic lines of credit that Calvin and Yvonne had taken out against their sprawling Buckhead mansion. He saw the zero balances on their retirement accounts and the mountain of unsecured credit card debt. And then he read the board of directors list for the private equity group that held the leash on their secondary mortgage. He saw my name sitting at the very top of that executive board. I could physically see the gears locking into place inside Judge Sterling's mind. He was connecting the dots in real time right there on the bench. He realized that the affluent, deeply concerned parents sitting in his courtroom were secretly bankrupt and drowning in insurmountable debt. He realized that the brilliant tech entrepreneur's son-in-law was a total fraud actively hiding from federal investigators. And he realized the most horrifying truth of all. They were trying to legally enslave an $85 million fintech mogul to steal her modest $250,000 inheritance just to save themselves from financial ruin. The implications cascaded through the judge's mind like a series of violent explosions. If my parents were bankrupt and I was a multimillionaire, then the entire premise of the conservatorship was a malicious, calculated lie. And if the premise was a lie, then the sworn testimony Calvin and Yvonne had just given, under penalty of perjury, was a federal crime. But it went even deeper than that. Judge Sterling looked at the medical affidavit submitted by Dr. Angela Vance. He realized instantly that the psychological evaluation was completely fabricated. My family had bribed or coerced a licensed medical professional to falsify health records in order to extort me. They had weaponized his courtroom. They had used the judicial system as a tool for criminal extortion. The transformation of Judge Sterling was terrifying and magnificent to witness. The shock and disbelief on his face hardened into a boiling volcanic fury. A dark red flush crept up his neck, and his jaw set like granite. He gripped the edges of the leather binder so tightly his knuckles turned white. The disrespect, the absolute mockery of his authority, and the law was more than he could tolerate. Harrison, still completely clueless about the radioactive bomb sitting on the judge's desk, took a step forward. "Your Honor?" Harrison began, his voice dripping with his usual slick arrogance. "As you can see from whatever meager financial records opposing counsel has provided my clients, daughter is in no position to manage capital." Judge Sterling did not let him finish the sentence. The judge grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down onto the sounding block with a concussive explosive force that echoed through the entire courtroom like a gunshot. The sound was so violent that my mother actually shrieked and physically jumped in her seat. Jada gasped, clutching Preston's arm up in the gallery. Calvin flinched, his arrogant posture shattering instantly. "Stop immediately!" Judge Sterling roared, his voice booming across the room with a terrifying, thunderous authority. Harrison froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in sheer terror. He took a stumbling step backward, raising his hands defensively as if he had just been physically struck. "Do not speak another word in my courtroom, counselor," the judge bellowed, pointing a shaking finger directly at Harrison. "Do not even breathe." The courtroom devolved into absolute paralyzed shock. Nobody moved. The court reporter pulled her hands away from her stenography machine. The bailiff stood at attention, his hand resting cautiously on his utility belt. My parents stared up at the bench, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated panic. They had never been spoken to with such ferocious authority in their entire lives. Judge Sterling stood up abruptly, his black robes billowing around him. He glared down at my family and their attorney with a look of absolute disgust. He had just uncovered one of the most malicious extortion plots he had ever seen in his career on the bench, and he was not going to let a single one of them walk out the door. Bailiff Judge Sterling shouted, his voice cutting through the thick, terrified silence of the room. "Call security right now. Lock the doors. No one leaves this room. I want deputies in here immediately." The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. The walls of the courtroom had just become the walls of their prison. I remained perfectly still in my chair, sitting beside Elias, feeling the cold, hard satisfaction of absolute victory coursing through my veins. The illusion was dead. The execution had begun. The heavy metal deadbolts of the courtroom doors clicked into place with a resounding finality that echoed like a vault sealing shut. Two armed bailiffs immediately took their positions, blocking the only exit. The panic that swept through the plaintiff's side of the room was instantaneous and utterly spectacular to witness. Attorney Harrison completely lost whatever slick composure he had left. His hands began to shake so violently that the expensive leather briefcase he was holding slipped from his grasp, crashing onto the floor and spilling perfectly organized legal pads everywhere. He stared at Judge Sterling with wide, terrified eyes. Harrison was a predatory lawyer, but he was not stupid. He knew exactly what it meant when a federal judge ordered the doors locked. He realized in a fraction of a second that he had just submitted fabricated medical affidavits and perjured financial claims onto the official court record. He had walked into the courtroom expecting a routine conservatorship hearing and was now staring down the barrel of a federal indictment for orchestrating a criminal extortion plot. While Harrison was hyperventilating, Elias made his final surgical strike. My attorney did not say a word. He simply reached into his own briefcase, pulled out a single neatly stapled copy of the corporate debt acquisition portfolio, and casually tossed it across the center aisle. The document landed squarely on the plaintiff's table, sliding right to the edge. Preston, who had jumped up from the gallery bench in a panic, leaned over the wooden railing to see what was causing the judge to react with such ferocious anger. His eyes locked onto the document Elias had thrown. I watched Preston grab the paper, his hands trembling as he read the bold header. It was the complete summary of his failing technology startups, toxic debt now legally owned and fully controlled by Horizon Capital Holdings. He read the signature line at the bottom, identifying me as the chief executive officer with absolute authority to liquidate his assets, call in his loans, and force him into immediate bankruptcy. The blood drained from Preston's face so fast he looked like he might actually pass out. His jaw went slack and his eyes darted from the paper directly to me. For the first time in his arrogant, entitled life, Preston looked at a black woman and felt absolute soul-crushing terror. He realized that the person he had belittled, mocked, and tried to legally enslave was the exact same person holding the guillotine blade over his entire future. Self-preservation is a fascinating thing to observe. The moment Preston realized he was financially tied to a sinking ship and legally implicated in a massive fraud scheme, his loyalty to my family evaporated into thin air. He did not hesitate. He threw the document back onto the table and physically backed away from the wooden railing, distancing himself from my parents, as if they were suddenly contagious. "I had nothing to do with this," Preston shouted, his voice cracking as it echoed through the locked courtroom. He threw his hands up in the air, looking wildly between Judge Sterling and the bailiffs. "I did not know anything about a forged medical affidavit. Calvin and Yvonne told me they had legitimate evaluations. They lied to me. I am just a concerned family member. I did not sign any of those fraudulent petitions." Jada, who had been sitting frozen in the gallery, let out a high-pitched gasp of sheer disbelief. She stood up, grabbing Preston's arm, trying to pull him back. "Preston, what are you doing?" she cried, her voice thick with panic. "You told them to file the paperwork. You said we needed the money." Preston violently ripped his arm out of her grasp, shoving her back slightly. "Shut your mouth, Jada," he hissed, his face contorted with panic and rage. "I am not going to federal prison because your insane parents decided to bribe a therapist. I have my own company to protect. I am not going down with your psychotic family." Jada let out a guttural, hysterical sob, collapsing back onto the wooden bench. The pristine golden child who had spent her entire life following the rules to secure her perfect status symbol husband was now watching him publicly humiliate and abandon her to save his own skin. She buried her face in her hands, wailing uncontrollably as the reality of her shattered life crashed down around her. Down at the plaintiff's table, my parents were utterly paralyzed. Calvin tried to stand up, perhaps to defend his favorite son-in-law, or maybe to attempt a desperate apology to the judge. But before he could even straighten his posture, Judge Sterling pointed his wooden gavel directly at him. "Sit down and keep your mouth shut, Calvin," the judge commanded, his voice radiating pure venom. "You and your wife just stood in my courtroom, raised your right hands, and committed felony perjury to steal from your own daughter. You submitted falsified medical records to extort a citizen of this state." Judge Sterling looked over at the armed bailiffs. "Detain them," he ordered firmly. "Take Calvin and Yvonne into the holding cells immediately. Contact the district attorney and inform them we have a live extortion and fraud case. Furthermore, contact the state medical board. I want the psychologist who signed this garbage affidavit investigated and stripped of her medical license before the sun goes down." Two bailiffs marched down the center aisle, their hands resting securely on their utility belts. They approached my parents' table. Calvin raised his hands in surrender, his arrogant, stoic facade completely broken. He looked like a terrified, fragile old man. My mother, Yvonne, did not go quietly. The moment the bailiff placed a hand on her elbow, her legs gave out. She went completely limp, dropping to the floor and screaming my name. "Kendra, please," she wailed, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "We are your parents. We love you. We were just trying to help. Please tell them to stop." I sat perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had happily plotted to lock me inside a psychiatric ward just hours prior. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply watched with cold, calculating satisfaction as the bailiffs hauled her to her feet and escorted her toward the side door leading to the holding cells. Calvin followed right behind her, his head bowed in absolute disgrace. Harrison stood alone at the table, trembling visibly. He looked at Judge Sterling, attempting to invoke attorney-client privilege and pleading that he had no idea the documents were falsified. Judge Sterling cut him off with a look of pure disgust. "Save your breath," Harrison, the judge, sneered. "I am personally forwarding this entire transcript to the State Bar Association. You will be lucky if you are only disbarred and not sharing a cell with your clients." The carnage was absolute and total. In the span of 5 minutes, my toxic family had been completely dismantled. The empire I built in the shadows had not just shielded me from their attacks, it had provided the exact leverage needed to obliterate their fake high society reality. I sat beside Elias, feeling the weight of the past 10 years lift entirely from my shoulders. The ambush was over, and I was the only one left standing. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of Judge Sterling's courtroom sealed my family inside their own trap. The fallout was swift, absolute, and entirely public. When you build an entire life on a foundation of lies and stolen money, the collapse is never quiet. It is a deafening spectacle, and I watched every single second of it unfold from a comfortable distance. Let us start with Harrison. The slick, overly polished attorney who thought he could steamroll a black woman with forged medical documents learned a very harsh lesson about federal court. Judge Sterling made good on his promise. He handed the complete courtroom transcript directly to the State Bar Association and the district attorney. Harrison was disbarred within weeks, stripped of his license and his livelihood. But the legal system was not finished with him. Because he knowingly submitted fabricated medical affidavits to extort capital, he was indicted on multiple felony charges, including conspiracy to commit fraud and perjury. He tried to negotiate a plea deal by throwing my parents under the bus, claiming they misled him, but the paper trail proved he was the chief architect of the legal strategy. The man who wore custom-tailored suits and sneered at me from across the aisle is now facing serious time in a federal penitentiary. His lucrative career was entirely incinerated by his own arrogance. Then there are my parents. Calvin and Yvonne experienced a financial and social annihilation so thorough it felt almost biblical. The private equity firm where I hold an executive board seat did not grant them a single extension. We initiated foreclosure proceedings on their sprawling Buckhead mansion the very next morning. I drove past the property on the day the bank officially seized it. I parked my car across the street and watched in absolute silence as a team of repo men loaded their expensive antique furniture into moving trucks. The imported luxury vehicles my father loved to show off were towed away in broad daylight, right in front of their wealthy neighbors. They were forced to pack whatever clothes they could carry and vacate the premises. They had spent their entire adult lives pretending to be the elite, trying to climb a social ladder built on toxic debt. Now they had absolutely nothing. But the financial ruin was only half of their punishment. The true devastation came from the total collapse of their precious church optics. The local Atlanta news stations caught wind of the courtroom drama. You cannot have prominent society members arrested for extortion by a federal judge without the press finding out. The headline ran on the evening broadcast detailing how a wealthy Buckhead couple attempted to illegally institutionalize their own daughter to steal her inheritance. The megachurch congregation that my mother had weaponized against me turned on her with breathtaking speed. The same people who had sent me pitying text messages and prayed for my mental breakdown immediately severed all ties with Calvin and Yvonne. The head pastor publicly denounced their actions during a Sunday service, framing their greed as a cautionary tale of moral decay. They were officially excommunicated. The high society circle they worshipped treated them like radioactive waste. They are currently renting a tiny cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely ostracized and drowning in legal fees from their impending criminal trial. And then there is the golden child and her perfect husband. Preston proved exactly what kind of man he was the moment the gavel fell. He did not stay to comfort his hysterical wife. He did not hire a defense attorney to help my parents. He did the only thing a coward knows how to do. He ran. The very morning after the courtroom explosion, Preston filed for a rapid divorce. He realized that staying married to Jada meant being legally tethered to a family facing federal fraud charges. He abandoned his failing technology startup, liquidated whatever hidden personal assets he could scramble together, and fled the state of Georgia entirely. He left in the middle of the night without even leaving a note. He left Jada holding the bag for everything. My sister, the woman who had spent her entire life shielded from consequences, was suddenly buried under a mountain of liability. Because she had co-signed several of Preston's early business loans to maintain the illusion of their wealthy lifestyle, creditors immediately came after her when he vanished. Jada was left entirely alone to deal with the shattered remnants of her social standing and a massive crushing wave of legal debt. The designer bags and the luxury vacations were gone, instantly replaced by collection calls and court summons. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Jada tried to reach out to her former high society friends for a loan, but they all blocked her number. She lost the pristine reputation she had built her entire identity around. She is currently working a grueling retail job just to pay off the interest on the debts Preston left behind. The golden child was finally forced to enter the real world without a safety net, without a wealthy husband, and without parents who could bail her out. I remember the one time Jada tried to contact me during these last 6 months. It was a voicemail left from an unknown number. Her voice was unrecognizable, stripped of that dripping artificial sweetness she used to use. She sounded ragged and exhausted, begging me to call off the debt collectors, claiming she had no idea how bad things were going to get. I listened to the entire message sitting in my spacious corporate office. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I simply deleted the voicemail and went back to reviewing my quarterly acquisitions. She made her choices when she sat in that courtroom and giggled at the thought of me being institutionalized. My parents also tried a desperate tactic. Yvonne attempted to corner me outside my commercial office building a few weeks after the foreclosure. She looked disheveled, wearing a coat that was entirely out of season, her perfect hair now completely unkempt. She tried to grab my arm, crying real tears this time, pleading for me to drop the civil suits and help them pay for a criminal defense lawyer. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, the woman who stood in front of a megachurch and called me a drug addict. I did not raise my voice. I simply stepped out of her reach and told my private security detail to escort her off the premises. I owed her absolutely nothing. They had dug a massive grave for me and planned to bury me alive inside it. Instead, they fell directly into the pit of their own making. I walked back into my corporate building, feeling the warm Atlanta sun on my face. The mourning period for the family I never had was long over. They thought they could strip away my freedom and take the wealth I had sacrificed everything to build. They found out the hard way that when you push a woman who has already survived your worst abuse, you do not break her. You just set her free. As the sun dips below the horizon, the sprawling city of Atlanta transforms into a brilliant sea of gold and white lights. I stand on the expansive wraparound balcony of my luxury penthouse, feeling the cool evening breeze brush against my face. The glass of sparkling water in my hand catches the soft ambient glow from the skyscrapers towering in the distance. From up here, the world looks peaceful, orderly, and completely under my control. It is a stark contrast to the absolute chaos my biological family tried to drag me into. I take a deep breath of the crisp air, pulling it all the way into my lungs. For the first time in 35 years, my chest does not feel tight with anxiety. My shoulders are not braced for an impending attack. The heavy, suffocating weight of my parents' expectations has been permanently lifted. Looking out over the glittering skyline, I allow myself to deeply reflect on the events of the past year. What I did to my family was not an act of revenge. It was an act of profound, necessary survival. I performed an amputation on a toxic family tree. The word amputation sounds violent and brutal, but anyone in the medical field will tell you that it is a life-saving procedure. When a limb is infected with gangrene, you cannot heal it with bandages or positive thinking. If you do not cut it off, the rot will rapidly spread to your heart, and it will kill you. My parents and my sister were infected with a terminal case of greed, arrogance, and absolute moral decay. If I had allowed them to remain attached to my life, they would have dragged me down into their abyss of bankruptcy and criminal fraud. I had to sever the connection entirely to save my own life. In the African American community, we are frequently conditioned to endure unacceptable behavior in the name of familial loyalty. We are taught from a very young age to honor our mother and father, regardless of how much damage they inflict. We are told to pray away the abuse and to keep family business strictly inside the house. I had to actively unlearn decades of that toxic conditioning. I had to realize that sharing DNA with someone does not give them a blank check to exploit your finances and destroy your mental health. Respect is a two-way street, and unconditional love should never require unconditional submission to abuse. I had to give myself permission to walk away without carrying a single ounce of guilt. I look up at the clear night sky and think of my grandfather. He was the only person who saw my true potential. He bypassed his own son because he recognized the rot setting into our family dynamic long before I had the vocabulary to describe it. He handed me his legacy because he knew I possessed the diamond-hard spine required to protect it. That $250,000 inheritance remains completely untouched, sitting in a secure, high-yield trust fund designed to benefit a future generation. It will be used for children who will be raised entirely outside of my parents' toxic shadow. I protected his life work, and in doing so, I secured my absolute freedom. Today, my life is beautifully quiet and incredibly full. My financial technology firm is expanding internationally. I am surrounded by a chosen family of fiercely loyal friends, brilliant colleagues, and legal mentors like Elias, who respect my mind and protect my peace. I no longer have to shrink myself to fit into a modest decoy apartment. I no longer have to hide my $85 million net worth behind cheap clothes and scuffed linoleum floors. I walk through the world exactly as I am, a powerful, successful, unbothered Black woman who answers to absolutely no one. The fake high society church optics that ruled my childhood mean nothing to me now. I traded the illusion of a perfect family for the reality of a perfect peace. I stepped closer to the glass railing of the balcony, resting my hands against the cool metal. I looked down at the bustling city streets far below where traffic flows in endless rivers of red and white light. My parents wanted to see me broken on those streets. They wanted me locked inside a sterile psychiatric ward, stripped of my autonomy, and heavily medicated just so they could fund a fraudulent lifestyle for a son-in-law who abandoned them at the first sign of trouble. They brought dirt to bury me and expected me to quietly lie down in the grave they dug. They thought they could bury me because I didn't fit their mold. But they didn't realize that while they were busy maintaining an illusion, I was busy building an empire. True family doesn't demand your destruction to fuel their survival. If someone hands you a shovel to dig your own grave, use it to build your castle instead. If you are watching this and you are currently suffocating under the weight of toxic family expectations, I want you to know that you are not alone. You have the right to protect your peace. You have the absolute right to walk away from people who only value you for what they can extract from you. Your worth is not determined by an abusive parent or an entitled sibling. Please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if this story resonated with you. I want to build a community of survivors here. Go down into the comments below and share your own stories of walking away from toxic family dynamics and reclaiming your power. Let us remind each other that the best response to betrayal is massive, unstoppable success. Thank you so much for watching, and remember to keep building your empire. The most profound lesson from this journey is that sharing DNA does not guarantee unconditional love or loyalty. When the people who are supposed to protect you view you merely as a disposable asset, your greatest defense is silent resilience. You do not have to accept abuse disguised as familial duty, nor do you owe your success to those who actively tried to engineer your downfall. Walking away from a toxic environment is not an act of betrayal. It is a vital act of self-preservation. True power lies in recognizing your own worth and building your empire so robustly that no one can ever tear it down. If this message resonates with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own story of reclaiming your power in the comments below.